And that's true of issues as well as politicians. You know, it's possible to pick and choose, order a la carte. The left in particular right now is prone to set menu politics. So they think that if you order the
it's the prefix menu.
Yeah, same idea. That you have to, if you order the anti-racism appetizer, then you have to get the pro-transgenderism for children main course. I mean, no, you don't. You can be utterly consumed with fighting racism as you understand that battle and decide that children should not get puberty blockers, right?
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. Our guest on this edition is an award-winning and New York Times best-selling novelist who said a few years back in lamentation of the non-fictional state of the publishing industry, quote, "If an agent submits a manuscript by a gay transgender Caribbean who dropped out of school at 7 and powers around town in a mobility scooter, it will be published whether or not it is incoherent, tedious, meandering, and insensible," end quote. Lionel Shriver doesn't mince her words. She reviles so-called sensitivity readers. We'll get to that. Which is at least part of the reason she does produce wonderfully compelling novels, including We Need to Talk About Kevin, which you may remember was optioned into a film starring Tilda Swinton and John C. Reilly. And most recently, Should We Stay or Should We Go?, The Motion of the Body Through Space, and nonfiction, a nonfiction offering, Abominations, selected essays from a career courting self-destruction. Could sort of paraphrase Steven Seagal, Lionel Shriver is hard to cancel. We'll also tackle the plot of her forthcoming novel, Mania, and the social commentary she intends around the fictional, for now, Mental Parity movement featured in the story. Shriver also provides pointed political and cultural commentary at The Spectator. Shriver is American educated, but an expat who has spent most of her adult life in merry old England. But I understand she's making another move, and we'll talk to her about that as we plumb the depths of her fertile mind. Lionel Shriver, welcome, and thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
So I want to start with where I ended that little run-up there, which is the move I read about. You're leaving England for Lisbon, or at least for Portugal. So why? Because the way I read your explanation of it was very reminiscent of my thinking about why I moved from the Midwest, namely Chicago, down to Southwest Florida. So I just want to sort of understand if we're living parallel lives in terms of the dynamics that are prodding us to go from one place to another.
Yeah, I think that we may have similar reasons. I began to be gradually disillusioned with the UK on a host of levels. On a functional one, it seems to be gradually falling apart. And I feel a little traitorous saying that because I've lived there for decades and I have strong connections to the country and a lot of affection for not just the country abstractly, but also a lot of Britons. So leaving wasn't easy, and I didn't leave lightly. But just for example, the Brits are real rule followers. So when they commit to net zero by 2050 and a host of other targets much sooner than that, they're going to enforce it. And the goals are unachievable. And they're going to make life unaffordable for their population. They're going to make everyone buy electric cars without any electricity. Little matter.
Right.
And I just foresee all kinds of decay. The police force it has woked out and now spends a huge proportion of its energies prosecuting people who misgender others. You know, and it's a lot easier, of course, than going after actual criminals. Now I could go again.
Well, we've seen some of that even recently too with the obviously the Hamas attack in Israel and the competing groups of protesters in London. We've seen some of that too, where the police are telling Israeli protesters who are driving around with pictures of the persons who were kidnapped by Hamas and saying, stop driving around, turn the lights off, take those posters down because you could engender a violent response. And so, I mean, I understand, and I think most of our viewers understand that England doesn't provide the same First Amendment protections as the United States, but it's still pretty chilling that that's sort of the state's response to those who cannot peacefully protest.
Yes, and those protests and their volume have horrified me. And that's what's happened to the UK. Not least because of rampant immigration. So they have a huge Muslim population, a lot of whom are quite radicalized, especially on the matter of Israel. So it's one of those moments that you discover what happens when you let in a very large population of people who do not share your values.
And so, I mean, we've talked about that a little bit stateside too. Just to stay on this topic momentarily, what did we learn from the post 9/11 era? Because it seems like we're repeating a lot of the same mistakes that were made, and we're not bringing the level of seriousness to the conduct of certain individuals that we should, and including when it comes to policies related to multiculturalism or mass immigration. So obviously it wasn't visited upon England directly, but the world was united with America. Most of the world was united with America after 9/11. It seems like that's not the case here, and it seems like there's also a real resistance to admit that some of the policies that have been pursued by both parties in England, or like both parties in the United States, have laid the foundation for the kind of barbaric behavior we see.
I think in the UK and the US, the situation is a little different. One of the big concerns after 9/11 was, of course, that we would have all these anti-Muslim hate crimes. And there were some incidents, but it really wasn't that bad. And it's partly because in the US, Muslims have immigrated to the country in relatively small numbers compared to other cultures, and therefore, at that time anyway, most Muslims had pretty well assimilated into American culture, and that's not the case in the UK. So there's much more of a quorum in the UK. You don't have to assimilate. There are whole towns and cities which are majority Muslim immigrants or the descendants of immigrants, and therefore, in the UK, the people making all that noise on the streets and saying, gas the Jews and everything, that's a novel idea. They are mostly Muslim immigrants. I'm getting the impression that in the United States, the biggest problem is not Muslim immigrants, but white woke students.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's generally the case, although not exclusively so. But yes, I mean, it is the sort of the left elite, as most illustrated by what's happening on college campuses, and that spills over into other realms too. But I think you're right. But it's interesting to me. So there still are some similarities. I mean, with the left in this country, this is left elite again. You had Kamala Harris and Joe Biden roll out their strategy to combat Islamophobia because they're trying to middle the issue. And so it's very reminiscent of post 9/11. Particularly when Barack Obama was elected, where we were still dealing with incidents of domestic terrorism committed by radicalized Islamists on American soil. And the response was, we're against violent extremism, generally speaking. And it's not necessarily primarily Islamic, and let's not other people. I mean, so that was the beginning of the sort of othering rhetoric that we started to hear. And to some extent, we're hearing that again as I said, the left tries to middle this issue and tries to deal with the internal fight within their ranks. But in the UK and France and Western Europe, it seems like we talked a lot after 9/11 about these no-go zones in places like Paris and to a lesser extent, I guess, London, but you would know better. And so almost 2 decades after the fact, when we're talking about that in the middle of the first decade of this century, it doesn't seem like anybody particularly addressed that, and maybe they exacerbated it.
Well, I think you're getting a response on the left as in very similar ways as to 9/11, because there was a minority of left-wing commentators who basically said that the U.S. deserved it, that we had brought this on ourselves, and there were even people on the left who bought into those Muslim conspiracy theories about how the Jews did it, and that we're getting the same thing in relation to Israel, that the left is saying, that Israel is basically an evil empire, and so never mind about massacring. The last figure I heard was 1,600.
Right, but I mean, you have a former president in Barack Obama, since I mentioned that era, who just recently said that we all have blood on our hands. We're all complicit in some way. This is the sort of the false moral equivalences that you're getting from many on the left as they try to appeal in an identitarian way, which is the only way they know how to appeal these days, to what they perceive to be coalition partners who are at odds. How do you keep Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar in check while still relying on the support from a majority of American Jews for your party and your politics? And this is what they're trying to massage. There's no moral clarity. There's no interest in moral clarity. There's just an interest in managing this coalition because it's fraying right now.
Well, that we all have blood on our hands business is just is taking refuge in such neutrality that you make no moral judgments. You don't criticize anyone, or you criticize everyone, and that being exactly the same thing. That's just an opting out. And I object to the fact that we immediately lost sight of Hamas having started this. The left retreats into so-called contextualization, and and that just means stepping back far enough that you can include Israeli bad actions, and therefore, once again, they asked for it. That's what contextualization means. But the truth is that Hamas could have anticipated, and I am certain did anticipate, the kind of reaction they have got out of Israel, and they wanted it. That was the intention, and they knew what would happen. They knew that the rest of the world would immediately switch its attention to what they did, to what Israel was doing to them, and therefore they could assume their conventional victim status, which is where they're comfortable, and get everyone feeling sorry for them.
Yeah, it's interesting too. They contextualize to go back, but not go back too far. Go back just the right amount. They don't want the whole truth, despite their protestations to the contrary. Because if the whole truth was told, as Joseph Epstein has pointed out in a recent piece he wrote for Real Clear Politics, if we're going to talk about settler colonialism, then it's the Arab population that has a problem, because Jews were in Israel 1,500 years before before Arab individuals were. So, it's to go back here and go back there and pick your spots and, cherry pick your spots, but it's not really to provide sort of a wide breadth for a real honest discussion. All of these sort of catchphrases and watchwords they use to pretend they're doing something other than what you just described, which is to say as little as they can on the topic to appease as many as they can.
Well, also this business of going back and back. The truth is that most of the people who have some of the strongest views on this, especially anti-Israel, don't know anything about the history. And I don't pretend myself to be some kind of expert. But I do at least know that Israel was not colonized by Jews, but it was voted into existence by the United Nations. And I think most of the left-wing activists out on the street right now have no idea.
Well, there was some good MOS in the UK by sort of the citizen journalists asking some of the younger people that were protesting and chanting, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Which river and which sea? I think it's the Mediterranean. I'm not sure about the river. So, what does that tell you about issues like this in terms of what the real motivation is from many who are joining in the protests and the chanting of the approved phrases?
Well, I'm of the view that at least in the United States, this really has very little to do with the Middle East. It is more domestic factionalism, and this is one of their red button issues, but they don't know what they're talking about, and I don't think they genuinely care about that part of the world. It's a pose.
You mentioned the police running around chastising, if not arresting, people for misgendering somebody who identifies as something other than their biological sex. And of course, J.K. Rowling has been sort of a lightning rod in the UK on this topic, as have others, but she's pretty high profile and unyielding too, which makes her even more of a lightning rod. And so I wonder, how that factors in too, in terms of what kind of society the UK is becoming, and your decision to leave.
Well, yes, the UK has swallowed woke world whole, and I find it embarrassing, not just because the ideology itself is embarrassing, but because they didn't even make it up. I mean, it's on top of being idiotic and self-destructive, it's imitative, and that's just undignified. I mean, it used to be that the U.S. derived from the British, and now the British derive from the Americans.
So it all ended with The Office. That's the last great U.S. imitation of UK cultural offerings. So now thinking about that, people always ask here, how much more do they want? When is it going to stop? Are you getting those sorts of rhetorical questions being asked of people who aren't looking for a fight? They're sort of exhausted and confused as to what to do, probably a little bit frightened as well. And is there any sort of active response to that question, or response, more importantly, other than from one-off celebrities that have profile, to this LGBTQ2S+++ movement?
I get asked all the time, when is this going to be over? And I have no answer, because how could I know? But I do pick up the desperation. People are getting sick to the back teeth, as they say in Britain all the time, of obsessions with race and gender and language, and want to get on with their lives and go back to the way things used to be. I think one of the biggest problems is that there are a lot of jobs on the line with this woke stuff. They have managed to generate a lot of positions, all the DEI nonsense. And nobody wants to lose their jobs. And furthermore, this ideology has infected the very upper levels of corporations, institutions like museums, certainly education, that goes without saying, and government. Even the Tory party, the Conservatives in Britain, have embraced the better part of this stuff. So they're certainly not conservatives with a small c. So it's hard to get rid of. It's like bed bugs.
Oh, yeah. Why did you, going all the way back, why did you decide to become an expat and live most of your adult life in the UK in the first place?
Well, I started out early in my career, just a lot of wanderlust, eagerness to explore the world. I set books in different countries in order to have new experiences and learn about elsewhere. And when I was first starting out, I actually imagined that I would just move to a new country every time I wrote another novel. Now, that was not knowing myself very well. I'm actually much more of a homebody than that. And so by the time I got to novel number 3, and I'd moved to Belfast to set it there, I got stuck in. And I did move to Kenya for my 4th novel, but then I went back to Belfast. I liked it there. It was politically fascinating. And then my partner got a job in London, so I followed him there, and we split up, and I stayed. It wasn't, I find that a lot of the major decisions that we end up making in our lives are not deliberate. They're not planned. This was not planned. I did not ever intend to live 36 years in the United Kingdom. It just happened. The move to Portugal is one of the only moves I've ever planned. So it's probably not going to work out.
Well, but Portugal, I mean, it's an interesting choice. I've never been. I hear it's quite lovely. But I mean, certainly in terms of if politics is one of the motivators to move, at least as represented by Antonio Guterres at the United Nations, the politics in Portugal doesn't look a whole lot better than the politics in the UK. And I just wonder sort of the totality of the circumstances that led you to choose Portugal.
Well, it wasn't primarily politics, but I will say that there's a cultural coherence here that you can't find in most of Europe anymore. That is, it mostly has Portuguese people in it, and I like the feeling of solidarity that comes with that. I mean, it's still a totally foreign country to me, and I am a visitor and an immigrant myself. But it's very clear that I need to get with their program. This is their country. And it's got, it's a very small country. It's only 10 or 11 million people. But it has a lot of modest pride, and I like that. It has not so far become that woke, although I have to tell you that my heart fell when I discovered that I put that in quotes, Miss Portugal is a man.
Right. Yeah.
So it's on the way.
Yeah, you can't, there's no hiding. I mean, this is sort of the point to people who say, when is it going to end? Well, I don't know. When is it going to end? You tell me. What am I, the Oracle of Delphi? What are you going to do about it? What am I supposed to do about it? What are we supposed to do collectively about it? It's not going to end on itself. It's clearly established, the identitarians have clearly established there is no limiting principle that will restrain them in any way. So when is it going to end? Where is it going to stop? I mean, that's sort of a question that boomerangs back on the asker of the question, it seems to me.
Well, I think we do have an obligation to fight back. And I've been fighting back for what I would say specifically on these people and these issues since 2016. And it's taken a lot of my time. And I've spent a lot more effort on nonfiction than I ever used to, because this is a nonfiction problem. Although I also use fiction as much as possible. I especially employ humor in my novels to make fun of these people. And they really don't like ridicule. That's the kryptonite.
Right.
They like to be attacked.
Ridicule
They
the devil,
thrive
right.
on that, but they don't like you to poke fun of them.
Now, just to close the loop on Portugal, did you parachute in illegally, or did you follow a legal process to emigrate to that country? I'm just curious.
Oh, I followed every letter of the law, and in Portugal there are a lot of letters.
Yeah.
It was incredibly arduous. In fact, it was so demanding in terms of paperwork and various fees and procedures that I've met any number of people who tell me that, they've decided they're going to move to Portugal also, and I think, no, you're not. it's
Yeah.
way too much. And actually, I've got a column brewing in me right now, itemizing just everything I had to do and all the expenses I accrued in order to legally move here as a full-time resident, and compare that to just wading across the Rio Grande or just getting in a dinghy to cross the English Channel. And we collectively in the West make immigration, when it's legal, a nightmare. It is running a maze of procedures and documents. So, who wouldn't rather just go for a swim?
Right. Right. Yeah, especially when there are there are border communities that will ferry you around to wherever you want to go. There's so many sanctuary states and sanctuary cities to choose from. Of course, I wanted to get to the point about ridicule as a weapon against the totalitarian-oriented, I would describe them. I'm just intrigued by your forthcoming novel, Mania. Because I read an excerpt of sort of the plot, the mental parity movement that's featured in the story that you wrote, and I mean it immediately evoked Vonnegut and Harrison Bergeron, the handicapper in general, to make sure that everybody is right. And so I don't know if that parallel is correct, but I just wanted you to explain sort of at least the plot as much as you're willing to tell us about that novel that's forthcoming. And develop more of the idea of the use of ridicule to drive thought and conversation in a way that a lot of the great authors of a bygone era, the Vonnegut's and the Bradburys and of course the Orwells, did.
Oh, you're right. There's a long tradition here, and I'm following loyally in its footsteps. Mania is set in the near past. It starts in 2011, and I decided to set it a little bit in the past instead of the future, because I wanted to get behind what I perceived to be a series of manias in the last 10 or 12 years, which as a collective phenomenon has disturbed me even more than the content of each one. The transgenderism craze, the Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement. These are even the COVID lockdowns, and now the whole net zero thing. It's these waves of obsession that are now international, and so I wanted to make up my own mania. And I decided that someone writes a book that takes hold of everyone's consciousness, and it's claiming that there's no such thing as variable human intelligence, that everyone is as smart as everyone else, and if there seems to be a difference, it's only a processing issue. And And therefore, the fight for cognitive equality is the last great civil rights fight. So you can't call anyone stupid anymore, nor can you refuse to hire someone because they are thick. And of course, universities can no longer be discriminatory in terms of who's got something on the ball and who doesn't. In fact, naturally, because I love playing with language, that's why I do what I do, there's a lot of playing with the words that you can no longer use. For example, you can't be dumbstruck anymore because the very word dumb
right.
is
and sensitive.
Right. It's an outrage. So, it's got a light side, it's got a serious side. It's clearly making fun of the woke movement, but it's also trying to look at this general phenomenon of how it is that on a dime these days, everyone believes the same thing and says the same thing, and you cannot differ with it or you're an ex-denier. I find it very disturbing that people are so profoundly conformist and seem to forget that they ever believed anything else.
And you're right too. If you think about it, what are the last frontiers? Mental and physical athletic advantages. And so once you sort of level that playing field, and it's just about all these institutions having the proper representation across all of these intersectional criteria within their ranks, then you've achieved, I guess you finally achieved heaven on earth, utopians would tell us.
Well, that's where you get into the Harrison Bergeron territory, because everyone's obsessed, or certain people are, obsessed with equality. But we're not equal. We have many different kinds of talents. I can't sing. Nothing you do is going to make it so I can sing. I promise. I'm envious of people who have beautiful voices, and I only sing when no one else is around. So I'm never going to be equal to those people who have beautiful voices, and I just have to live with that. But we're no longer, on a larger social level, content to live with difference and with the fact that some people are better at things than others. And so, that is one of the themes.
I recently did a podcast with Shelby Steele, and he defiantly declared that racism is over. Are there individual instances of racist conduct? Of course, the human condition being what it is and man being fallen. But this idea that there's something systemic afoot against anybody, at least in America, and I think he would argue most of the West, that it's just not true. So maybe that's where we need to start, is just by telling young people, no one is getting a raw deal in the West, or I'll just stick with America, what I know. No one is getting a raw deal based on their association with a particular group. Now, there are individual people in different groups, an individual Black person, an individual Hispanic person, an individual Indian American who are going to get a raw deal on something, the justice system, a job, entrance into a school. There's going to be raw deals individually. But the idea that there's a collective group getting a raw deal just because they all have the same skin color or all share the same religion, that's just not a real thing. So stop pretending like you're part of a group that is systemically disadvantaged, and maybe then you start, and oh, by the way, you may want to look at other countries where there is such group identity and how it goes there and how quickly it descends into violence, group identity violence, as you just play king of the hill in perpetuity. Maybe that's the way to have a more directed conversation once we sort of to use your approach, ridicule them enough into having to actually think about things? What do you think?
Well, the trouble is that the left needs racism. They're obsessed with it, and therefore it has to be out there. And they will find it even if they have to make it up, which is in many instances what they have been doing. Essentially the left is running out of causes. I think that's one reason they're so hysterical about the Palestinian situation, because it's a cause. And you're right. I mean, in the big picture, the racism situation in the United States is pretty squared away. In fact, most of the discrimination that's actively going on right now is against the majority. And I'm on the record as opposing affirmative action, and that's the only kind of discrimination that I think is being pursued on a wholesale level. But when you've got a whole political stripe that is consumed with so-called structural racism, then it's going to be perceived, and it will never be fixed. This is what you said earlier. Nothing will ever be enough, and that's just the nature of the animal. They are insatiable.
Part of it too.
No liberation type movement, no self-perceived radical movement ever wants to achieve its ends, because then it's over. The fun is finished, and there's nothing to do, and you have no purpose. So
what happens?
So you have to be frustrated, and you have to fail in order to have purpose.
Right. What happens when the outside guy becomes the inside guy? We're seeing that a lot in America with, for example, Illinois has more black elected officials than any other state in the nation. Chicago and Cook County is completely controlled by black politicians, Democrats. And it's not going great. But it's hard to blame, white supremacy when you're in charge of everything, right? There are no conservatives in politically powerful posts. So then it's the reliance on the legacy of this and the legacy of that, and the manufactured slights and some of the inventions that you're talking about. So that's certainly true. The outside guy becoming the inside guy, that's always a fascinating dynamic, and it's playing out as well. But you mentioned that this is part of it too. You mentioned that you oppose affirmative action, but I also saw in a recent interview I think you gave with Unheard that you to characterize yourself as having benefited at one point in time from whatever wokeness was at that time, whatever manifestation it was at that time, the early iterations of it. So, just describe what you mean by having previously benefited from wokeness.
I'm not sure you are summarizing what I said exactly. I could at least say that, I was given a literary award that was reserved exclusively for women. And I've always been upfront about the fact that it would be more meaningful to me if I had won a prize that was open to men as well. But, I didn't turn down the prize, now did I? And I'm sure that there are invitations that I have received from events organizers or the news or what have you, because they needed a woman. They had too many men on a panel, and I had an advantage because I could help balance things out, and otherwise they might not have come to me. Again, even if I pick up this sense that, all these other people are male, so that's why I was asked on this panel. I don't refuse the invitation if I want to do the event. So
sure.
Yes, I know what it's like to be the beneficiary of a kind of affirmative action. That is affirmative action. Would I prefer always to be picked because I have something to say, or I am admired, or in some way, that my particular talents are coveted. Sure. So I would rather live in a world that I am always advantaged because of my merits and not my sex.
Well, but I mean, part of the reason I bring that up is just sort of people want to be fair-minded, and if a group like Black Americans was treated shabbily as they were for a long time in America through slavery and even after slavery and through Jim Crow and even after Jim Crow, some people say, well, okay, we need to, particularly for those who live through the harm, there needs to be some redress for those people who are harmed, and you want to be open-minded about that. But it's just difficult for some, when you create sort of an industry around the conferring of benefits and the imposing of costs, it's difficult for them to ever give that up. And then so you have now institutional inertia that pushes in that direction in perpetuity. This is another movement. And so we have to play the role of the Black American coming out of Jim Crow as opposed to what the Black American experiences in 2023 America. Right? I mean, to me, it's so intellectually stunting, and I think your sort of evolution is interesting because it infantilizes and freezes a person no matter how far removed they are from the harm, as a caricature of people who were harmed generations and generations ago. Does that make sense?
Sure, but it's worth bearing in mind that Blacks themselves, Black Americans, poll in majority as opposing affirmative action. And I'm with them, and I understand why. It's insulting, ultimately.
Yeah, right.
And most of all, it's undermining. I wouldn't want to think that I was admitted to a university because of my race, and that my scores were too low to get into this university, and I needed a leg up just because of this color of my skin. That would make me feel totally underconfident, and would make me worry that if it were a level playing field, I would be completely overlooked. That's not a nice feeling for anybody. And I think that is why Blacks don't like affirmative action. It's ultimately condescending.
I wanted to get to something you wrote about politics, generally speaking. I'm one to say that I never fall in love with a politician, and you never should, because they'll only break your heart. Right? These are not, our life partners. They're just our temporary representatives, and sometimes people get a little too attached. We see that actually too much of the time, the cult of personality. But you wrote recently about your a la carte politics, and I like that phrase, and I like the approach. And I think if there were more people that actually at least process politics that way, you might get some more interesting governing coalitions than you're otherwise inclined to get in the West in general. So can you expound on a la carte politics?
Sure. I mean, I feel that I'm as prey to factionalism as anyone, certainly during the culture war period. I'm very clear on which side I'm on. And that's a little bit of a trap. It's like backing a sports team. And I always have to remind myself that I'm not on a team, that I can think whatever I like about anything or anyone. So when a politician that I have generally admired or backed or even voted for disappoints me by saying something insensitive or insensible, I have to remember that I don't have to agree with that, and I can be disappointed, and I can just say, well, that was a silly thing to say. I'm not stuck with this person and everything they think and do. he's not a team member of mine that I have to support. And that's true of issues as well as politicians. It's possible to pick and choose, order a la carte. The left in particular right now is prone to set menu politics. So they think that if you order the
it's the prefix menu.
Yeah, same idea. That you have to, if you order the anti-racism appetizer, then you have to get the pro-transgenderism for children main course. I mean, no, you don't. You can be utterly consumed with fighting racism as you understand that battle and decide that children should not get puberty blockers, right? I mean, the issues really have nothing to do with each other. But the way we think now is that you just have to adopt this raft of positions, and they all come with the territory, and therefore you have to agree with your side on everything. And it's just not true. And you can release yourself and think on your own.
Speaking of that and thinking freely, how have you received all of this debate about quote unquote book bans in the United States, that are related to the LGBT2S plus and a lot of trans, right? That if a library, a school library, or an English class doesn't want to include something that is, in many cases, not even borderline, but pornographic, then somehow they're in the business of banning books because you're not mandating it in the curriculum or you're not providing it in an elementary school library. You're banning books. In fact, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who I know you had said positive things about previously, he has been hit over the last year plus over this sort of don't say gay and book banning and that sort of argument. I mean, as somebody who believes, as I do, that literature and works of art are so mission critical to a free society, so mission critical to Western civilization, how do you react to that? Because the left is trying to present themselves as the side opposed to Fahrenheit 451, as compared to the side that's prohibiting thought and expression and consumption of particular books.
Well, I think you're hinting at the fact that these are not actually book bans. I mean, if you ban a book, you can't get it. And just taking a book out of a school library, or in many instances, it's not even taking it from the library, but it's saying that the parents have to approve the child getting that book. So there's an extra process of a student getting his or her hands on it. But you can still get it on Amazon. You can still go into a bookstore and order it, and that therefore the book is not banned. Now, I am sympathetic with parents who are uncomfortable with libraries and school curricula promoting books that are not age appropriate or too graphic, that push children to question their gender before they even understand what the word means. In fact, most of us don't know what the word means anymore. I try to avoid it. And
most of us are struggling with. A lot of us are struggling with what woman and man means these days, much less gender. But yes, your point.
Well, I'm personally not struggling.
I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think parents taking some interest in what is in the school library or what their kids are being asked to read is perfectly reasonable. I saw the content of one controversial book that really, really took me aback. It was another of the trans books, and this is for kids, and it was about a girl who decided she was a boy and found everything about being female repulsive, and it was very graphic. It was a graphic novel, and so menstruation, for example, was presented as grotesque, and breasts were disgusting bulges, and it was frankly, I don't use this word lightly because it is overused, but it was flagrantly misogynistic in a way that, if I had a daughter, I would not want her to read that book.
I mean, culturally,
So,
what do you think what
go
do you
ahead.
think is behind books like that and other books, and there are countless examples that are so graphic sexually that, the phrase goes sexualizing children at a young age, pre-adolescence. And there are many examples of that. I mean, in fact, you have the great irony, I'm sure you've seen, as so many viewers have, where you have moms or dads come to a school board meeting and start reading from the book, and then they're shut down. You can't read that, in this public school board meeting. Well, then why is it in my third graders class? And of course, the irony is lost on the school board and the teachers union and so forth. But what do you think is behind the zeitgeist for these graphic, whether you say, as you say, misogynistic books, or just sexually explicit books that are targeted to, again, kids in the primary grades?
I think in a weird way, the effect is not sexualizing children, it's turning them off of sex in a way that is reproductively dangerous. I think we're confusing children so much on what sex is, what it's for, what it means, what you do. It's a big turnoff. It seems gross, and of course, at the same time, these kids are exposed to pornography, and one of the, especially for girls, if that's what sex is, well, why would they want any part of it? And I think it's a small contributor to the rage for transgenderism among adolescent girls, because if that's what it means to be a woman, they want no part of it. To be used like that and treated like an animal. I don't, in some weird way, I don't blame them.
Oh,
But
that's interesting. To make it distasteful, not more attractive. You're not promoting promiscuity. You're trying to further atomize the individual, such that what's the big deal if I play Mr. Potato Head with my body?
I don't think the transgenderism movement has much to do with sex. That is desire. It's a warped version of self-actualization, but it doesn't really have to do with libido, with wanting to do something with your body aside from reform it. I mean, after all, one of the effects of getting a sex change operation, as we used to call them, is, especially if you get it before puberty, is you are not sexually functional. You often can't orgasm, and so that particular phenomenon has bizarrely little to do with sex. There is that autogynephilia aspect for usually grown men, but they become such a tiny percentage of the population going through this agony, that I don't think that's a big factor anymore. I mean, after all, there have been plenty of polls done documenting that young people are having less and less sex. I mean, they don't see each other in person. They get what sexual thrills they find mostly on the internet, and they're just not doing it.
I wanted I mentioned this quote at the outset, and I know you've been asked about it a lot, and you're probably tired of answering it, but I'm hopefully presented in a novel way. Your comment on the state of the publishing industry, where you talked about if an agent submits a manuscript by a gay, trans, Caribbean who dropped out of school at 7 and powers around the town in a mobility scooter, it'll be published whether or not it's incoherent, tedious, meandering, and insensible. My question is not about, is that intemperate or not? Is that representative of what you think is the biggest threat to the literary arts, or is there something else afoot that's even bigger than greenlighting work based on the identity of the author rather than the quality of the work? Is that the biggest threat that we face in terms of producing great books and advancing great thinkers, or is there something else?
Well, I think publishing has suffered from demoting the importance of excellence. And I would say that more generally across the culture. It's not just publishing, that we're so consumed with equality and representation and inclusion that nobody seems to care whether people are doing their jobs, or much less doing their jobs well. And I do think that is a challenge to the arts, which have also got, all of the arts seem to have got sidelined into misunderstanding what their purpose is, that they're supposed to be representative. No, they're not supposed to be representative. They're supposed to make something interesting or beautiful or exciting. The arts are a luxury, but they're supposed to add something and stimulate their audience and not make their audience virtuous. I mean, I think that the arts have misunderstood themselves and what they are for. It is to make life in some way more enjoyable and more interesting, but not to make the audience good. It is not there's nothing wrong with having a political purpose in art, but all of the arts do not have to have a political purpose, and you are not your first your prime directive, if you will, is not moral improvement in your audience. You get to choose your own prime directive. I think any work of art has its own purpose, but it needn't be moral improvement. And I'm afraid that writers, I'll speak for my own profession, fiction writers too often now think that they're supposed to be essentially lecturing their readership and hectoring them into being nicer people. But that's not why I read a novel. I don't pick a book up thinking, maybe this person can make me nicer and more considerate of others. No, I want a good story. I want beautifully wrought prose. I want to wonder what happens. I want to get involved in the characters. I'm generally going to like characters who are a little bit bad, right? Or at least complicated. But I don't want to be lectured. So, well, I do think that the arts in general are going down a cul-de-sac.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of that, I do want to talk about your book, We Need to Talk About Kevin, because unfortunately it was prescient in so many ways. I mean, certainly there were psychotic kids who committed horrible crimes before you wrote the book, but in the last decade plus since the book has been written, and just even in the recent past, there's been even more. And the book was so good to me, and so was the movie, partly because you had a great cast with John C. Reilly and Tilda Swinton. But the book was so good because the characters were complicated. Every single one of them was flawed. The parents of this psychotic kid were flawed in different ways, and the dynamics were interesting. And one of the things, without getting too much into the weeds on it, but one of the things that I liked about it, as in terms of thinking about horrific things that happen, particularly if they're at the hands of a child, is how sort of fact-specific and complicated the answers probably are. Because when something like what happened in that Covenant School in Nashville, what happened in Maine recently, the massacre there, we think it's and this is across the political spectrum, we think it's a simple answer. It's everybody's mentally ill and they didn't know right from wrong. Or we need to ban this gun, or we need to ban this instrumentality of evil. Or it's the parents' fault, or it's society's fault, and we need to talk about Kevin was so interesting because at least I came away saying I don't know what I would have done. I think it's complicated. I think it was complicated for both the parents in that case. They made mistakes. They had flaws. The kid, they should have seen things they didn't see. Maybe, I don't know. And then we go through this in real life in so many of these horrific situations, like some of the examples I've given. And I agree with you. I think that's why it was an award-winning book and it was a good movie, is because that really is the complication. And if you get people thinking about things, maybe they get a better appreciation for how gray the world really is on some of these matters when you're trying to come up with easy solutions to make it better right away, and you fall prey to the charlatans out there in suits holding public offices.
Well, I think that's one area where fiction excels in a way that journalism doesn't. Fiction has the capacity to put together the kind of complexity that you're talking about. Not just complexity of character, but also complexity of ideas and complexity of cause and effect.
Circumstances.
Journalism by its nature, especially comment journalism, but even feature journalism, it simplifies. It has to. When you write an essay or a comment piece for a newspaper, you have to have a thesis, right? It can't be 5 theses all together. It's one. You're making one point, and then you support it. The trouble with that is that, therefore, you're going to probably argue that there is, for example, this one cause that is the leading reason that we have trouble with school shootings in the United States. Well, that's probably going to be wrong. That's not going to cover all of these instances. Whereas fiction can cast a much wider net and express, in the instance of the mass killing in the book, it wasn't a shooting. It was very specific. It was very specific to this kid and these parents. And it wasn't trying to make a larger observation that if only X, this would never have happened. In fact, one of the reasons that I chose not to use a gun, my killer used a crossbow, was I didn't want anyone to come along and say, well, the moral of this story is that we need more gun control in the United States. That just would have been so flattening to me. Even if I generally agreed with that position, I didn't want my novel to be reduced to that kind of bumper sticker politics.
I agree, and also too, it added that layer of. On the one hand, I'm going from memory here, but I think it was father and son. This is how he was taught archery, right? It was sort of a father-son bonding experience, right? So there's a bonding experience, and in isolation, you say, well, that's cool. That's a fun father-son thing to do. And then it turns out that he used this skill that he had developed with his father to horrific ends. And it's also with respect to groups. We want to say it's this group of people or it's that group of people. And it's just so much more complicated than that always. As Theodore Dalrymple, the great retired prison psychiatrist in England, said, well, you want to say it's this profile or that profile, but then you have to explain to me why millions of people that have a very similar profile don't commit these horrific acts. It's just not that easy. All of those not to contextualize, but all of the circumstances and the interpersonal dynamics, those matter, and they're just sort of glossed over in conversation. And I think it makes us, good fiction makes us better thinkers and perhaps more restrained about what we think we know, which is, sort of anything that induces modesty in this culture. That's something that's indispensable as far as I can tell.
I'm with you there.
Lionel Shriver, she is a New York Times best-selling author, award-winning novelist. Her next book, I don't know if you want to profile anything else, but her next book, which I'm looking forward to, which is why we previewed it, Mania. Lionel Shriver, thanks so much for joining us. I also look for her commentaries in The Spectator. Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. Best of luck, continued success with the books, and good luck with your new adventure in Portugal, too.
Thank you. I may need that luck.
All right. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time. Take care.